Hi everyone, I'm Steve Humphreys, the CEO of Clover Risk Funding, and this is the 5th episode of our podcast in Clover. At Clover, we do things differently. We provide a premium one-stop funding service to the insolvency profession focused on bespoke solutions that meet the unique needs of our clients. Today, keeping with the motif of doing things differently, we have two guests joining us, Damien Hodgkinson and Tony Wright, both Principals of Olvera Advisors and experienced insolvency practitioners. Damien, let's start with you. You've got more than 30 years experience working with distressed companies in financial assessment, recoverability and sustainability of risk assets. Tell us a bit about how you got started in insolvency and a bit more about your background.
Steve and I started in 1991 in the first recession. Got a call from Arthur Young, as it was then, and said, sorry, we've got no more positions in markets, but we do have a spot in the insolvency space. So that's how I started. Mm-hmm. And I've gone on from there. I spent most of my career actually in Asia and South America. So up in Hong Kong for 8 years, South America for a year and a half. And working in that space, you tended to work more with companies working around the insolvency regime. Mm-hmm. So that's where I got my background in restructuring. And when I came back to Australia in, I think it was 2004 with KPMG, that's where I just decided to focus. Creditors will never thank you for getting their money back, but a company will always thank you for returning money to shareholders. Yep. So that's the start I take.
And Tony, you're obviously over 15 years experience in the insolvency industry and interestingly had 5 years working in ASIC's enforcement division. Tell us a bit about how you got started in insolvency and a bit more about your background and how you got to where we are today.
Look, I really just fell into insolvency. I finished uni, wasn't sure which way I wanted to go with my accounting degree, and met someone that was in the insolvency game, and I got offered a graduate position and sort of went from there. The years rolled by, I think the early years in the 2000s, and I had a particular interest on the investigation side, and my employer at the time offered a secondment to me at ASIC, which I took up, and that ultimately saw me taking on a full-time role in their enforcement team, which took me over to Asia, where I investigated what was at the time the largest superannuation fraud in Australia's history. So 5 years on at ASIC, after two people went to prison, I decided it was time to come back into public practice. And
wasn't you that went to prison though?
It wasn't you that went to prison. No. So look, I made a decision to go back into the corporate world, and I took a role at Deloitte, and now I'm at Olvera.
Fantastic. And look, obviously, it's a similar story for almost everyone I speak to in insolvency. You don't start at uni going, I'm going to be an insolvency practitioner. You fall into it. I was the same. My first rotation as an article clerk was in insolvency, and I haven't left. I think that was more because my boss liked the fact that I played golf and it helped for marketing. Yep. That he would never let me leave. But we all end up in insolvency through different means, and then suddenly we end up, really loving it. Obviously, we're seeing an upward trend in insolvency appointments since coming out of COVID, and indeed the 23-24 financial year statistics paint a picture that indicates that it is worse than the previous 3 financial years before COVID. Damien, turning to you first, is what the statistics are telling us match with what you're seeing in the insolvency market?
Well, no. What we are seeing is a disconnect between the insolvency statistics that we're seeing coming through in the ASIC data and what we're seeing out in the market. And I think that's a reflection of the increase in the SBR program, which I still don't think has been well documented and well published. Like, we're having to do quite a significant education exercise to get people to understand that that's there. And we're seeing a significant increase following Safe Harbour around informal restructurings, and that's where we're seeing the majority of the work starting to happen.
And we're going to come back to SBR and Safe Harbour shortly, but I think what certainly is of interest is we've got this increase in informal restructures. Are there specific causes of stress that you're seeing in the market generally that are leading to those increases in those informal restructures?
Yes and no. So look, coming out of COVID, we saw some pretty significant changes to supply chain across the board. You couldn't get during COVID, you couldn't get a container out of China. China was controlling the container market. There were containers stuck in imports all around the world, and that was driving delay, cost increases, logistics increases across the board. And it's taken, and I don't even think it has fully filtered out of the market yet. Add that to the fact that the Australian dollar is edging lower and lower, and we import a lot of goods across the industry, construction industry included. A lot of parts are prefabricated overseas, and they come up as that. So we're importing a lot of inflation. So there's difficulties in getting supply. The cost of that supply is increasing. But I think probably the most significant change that we've seen, and this is post the last election, is wage growth increase. So labour has been scarce. There's difficulty in getting labour, especially with all of the government infrastructure projects and the introduction of the NDIS, and I can go into that further. But payroll is increasing. There's a scarcity of labour, and the cost of that labour is increasing. And I think that's driving across the board. That's driving cost increases, and that's making it very difficult for companies to make ends meet.
And Tony, noting those stresses that Damien just talked about on the appointments that you're seeing coming through, are there any particular industries that you think are overrepresented or we're seeing more of than others in the current market? And are there any special risk factors that you see in those industries that make them particularly vulnerable?
Well, certainly the retail space has been impacted. Building and construction is another area, as Damien flagged. But it's your small cafe owners, it's your real small business that are really seeing the impact due to issues with labour and other factors that we're seeing. Perfect candidates for the small business restructure.
Yep.
But ultimately, they are legacy debts that we're seeing, and it's not dealing with the ATO, during the COVID period and beyond, that is really the driving force behind the appointments that we're seeing, and certainly the inquiries that we're getting.
It was certainly something that I said a lot when people were asking me to talk about the market. We're still seeing, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong with this, this is why I'm posing the point. We're still seeing the companies that were bad in 2019 are still bad now in 2024, and we're just catching up. Is that a fair reflection of where you think we're at? You survived during COVID because of stimulus and because of lack of collection effort from the government around tax. So if you were bad before COVID, you're still bad now and you're going. Is that a fair reflection of where you think we are?
I think that's what I'm seeing. Certainly in the inquiries that I'm getting, people just can't catch up. They haven't been able to catch up, and I think again, going through that SBR process is certainly a mechanism for them to deal with those legacy issues. But I think some of the businesses we're seeing, I think the actual underlying business has improved or is solid. It's just that they haven't been able to deal with the history of COVID. With the legacy.
So we've mentioned SBR, we've mentioned Safe Harbour. They're moderately recent reforms in what we do in the insolvency world. I might start with you, Damien. What are your views on these reforms? You've already mentioned they're probably not being deployed as much as they can, but do you think where they are being deployed, they're being effective in helping distressed businesses?
No. And look, I think I don't think Safe Harbour goes far enough. And it hasn't been, there's no cases in relation to how Safe Harbour will work. And Safe Harbour is effectively a defence against insolvent trading that a director may have. It's no benefit directly to the company, with the exception that it keeps directors at the table, keeps them to make transparent and ethical decisions, and keeps control of the business. No offence to my profession, but I've never seen value return really come out of a liquidation. Value return will always come out of a restructuring. What I think we're going to see, and what I hope we'll see, is a combination of the SBRP process and the Safe Harbour rules coming together, creating almost like a Chapter 11 protection strategy that exists in the US. So they'll raise the bar on a small business restructuring. It might be 5, it might be 10, and they'll keep slowly increasing that. And combination with that and the Safe Harbour provisions, we'll start to see some really decent restructuring work start to happen. And for companies, not just the directors, to have the protection they need.
Tony, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the threshold requirements probably need to change.
Yep.
I think at the moment it's set at $1 million. Your debts have got to be under $1 million. I think obviously that provides limitations to those that are eligible and can use the product. But I think some changes to that will see more businesses thrive and ultimately survive through a restructuring process.
It's interesting that you mention, safe harbour being used as a shield for directors. Obviously, I've spent the better part of the last 6 years, particularly looking at insolvent trading cases, looking at defences, and looking at what to fund. And I think I can say I've never seen a safe harbour done well, and I've never seen it actually deployed well as a defence. We've had these reforms for a while now, and I would have expected some cases to come through, but it's a little bit of a folly of our market where we don't litigate. Australia is a country, and that sounds weird for a litigation finance professional to be saying that, but we don't bring insolvent trading cases to trial. So we're not going to see safe harbour tested, which makes it a little bit counterintuitive on the deployment of it.
Well, I think that's part of the fact that insolvency practitioners and insolvency legal practitioners use insolvent trading as a stick to generate the appointment. And if you start to really delve into what insolvent trading represents in a company, you start to look at when was the debt incurred. And for the majority of the claims in a company you see now, that debt was incurred right back at the beginning.
Yes.
So the number of claims that can actually be hooked into an insolvent trading claim, when you start to dig into it, it's quite small. And when you add in the cost of litigating, you need the claim to be at least $1 million plus before it warrants the time and cost, the litigation, the practitioner's investment, to even start to make the returns on that worthwhile.
Oh, look, I'd certainly agree with that, being someone who looks at these cases all the time. I'm interested in the thought of having a form of Chapter 11 like they have in the US, having just recently been in the US and hearing some stories around the Chapter 11 process and the like. It's interesting that I think we all agree there needs to be some sort of move to that process, but the Australian market also seems to be quite a bit ahead around litigation related to Chapter 11. We were listening to a very interesting case study on how a Chapter 11 process was being stopped by where 95% of the creditors had approved it, but one of the 5% sued and had taken it right up to the Supreme Court in the US because it's a no-cost jurisdiction. There's no ramifications for that. If we were to bring in something like a Chapter 11 process, I assume we still be thinking that there needs to be some ramifications for trying to stall those processes. It wouldn't be just a complete pickup of the American process, I would assume.
Oh, the American process has a lot of negatives about it. It's manipulated by jurisdiction. You will see the issues that are coming out of the Texas courts in relation to how they were handling the conflicts that they've been handling a lot of the Chapter 11 processes. The US jurisdiction hunts to determine where they're going to run the restructuring. Australia runs a national court system. There's common law principles apply from one court to one state to the next, from one jurisdiction to the next. So it makes it. I think Australia is a lot fairer as a legal market, much fairer than the US.
And if we go back a step, we've talked about the reforms and everything else, and I'm going to get back to litigation in a minute because obviously it's where I like to play. But I couldn't resist the opportunity to talk to both of you guys about the fact that you are at the front line when a distressed business or a client approaches you as a restructuring professional. Often you're the first person they've spoken to, or if you aren't the first person they've spoke to, you're taking the first call when they're in significant distress. What are the main difficulties that you strike? And Tony, I might start with you. When you're first approached to assist a distressed client or a distressed business, and how can those distressed businesses better prepare to be engaging with an insolvency professional?
I think getting advice early. Quite often we will we'll be approached by someone and they've left it too late, which reduces the options that are available. I think getting the right advice through the right, whether it's a lawyer or other advisor, including ourselves, at the earliest, as soon as the indicators are there, they need to be getting on the phone and talking to a practitioner about their options. But that's certainly the biggest thing I've seen, certainly in the last 12 months, 6 to 12 months, is some people have just left it too long, which limits, like I said, the options.
And we're talking about indicators. What, if you had to, if there are business owners listening to this podcast that don't know what the indicators are, what would be your top 3 indicators that they need to make a phone call?
The tax office was quite simply the first one, I would say. If you've got a legacy debt, you've been going through a payment plan process with the ATO, you're struggling to meet those payments, come and see someone rather than borrowing money from across assets or other avenues. Come and see a practitioner to talk about whether or not the voluntary administration regime or process is the right choice or other options. It could be there are many options that are available, subject to getting in early.
Look, I'd add to that, Stephen. The ATO through COVID was very flexible.
Yes.
They were not taking a lot of action. In fact, they were making it very easy for businesses to continue. So they're sitting on that legacy. And I would have said in the last 6 months, they've now switched to the other side and they're getting very aggressive about the collection process. And it is still a little bit of a matter of who you get in the tax office. But the collection processes are much more aggressive than it's been before. And companies aren't used to that.
Yep.
So they've had COVID time where they've basically been able to call up payment plan renewed, payment plan fails, payment plan renewed. And now it's like, no further. So what we've been seeing in the construction industry, which was one of the major beneficiaries of those payment plans, we're seeing a lot of subcontractor insolvency in that space where the ATO has just gone, we've had enough, and not accepting any more payment plans and issuing directors penalty notices. And they're having no choice but to put the company into administration. But
the key message though is early. As early as you can, as early as you feel the stress, make a phone call to an insolvency professional. Don't go to the yellow pages and just pick the first one you see. Would you be suggesting do some research, pick the right one for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think seek advice from your lawyer would be the first thing to do, and then obviously reach out to a practitioner.
Picking an insolvency practitioner is kind of like picking a shrink.
It is.
Yeah.
You've got to see a few of them before you find one you like.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I think the chances of picking the right one first out, and it's a line I like to use, is like throwing a dart into the back of another dart in a hurricane. You've actually got to take your time to find the one that you can work with and find the one who has a solution set that works for you. Because I think there are different solution sets depending on the practitioners that you're talking to.
And sometimes they bite you.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, one of the interesting things for me, obviously sitting again principally on the litigation side, is what I would call the rise of the bad restructuring practitioner, the rise of the Phoenix practitioner. Do you have any tips for, again, business owners who are listening around, how to pick out that they're getting the wrong advice, like a Phoenix type advice? Tony, you've worked for ASIC.
Yeah, I think be wary of the pre-insolvency advisor. Check credentials. Make sure the advisor that you're seeing is a registered liquidator.
Yep.
Because quite ultimately what happens, the pre-insolvency advisors get involved, provide sometimes the wrong advice, or ultimately introduce the client to an insolvency practitioner. Yep. So you're ultimately paying twice.
Yep.
For the same service, because they can't obviously conduct the insolvency process.
And obviously going through getting advice that sounds like, yes, you can keep trading and we're going to keep all the debt in an old company. For people who are listening, if you're getting that advice is bad. That's an easy statement to make, isn't it?
That's a very easy statement to make, yes.
Don't do that.
Well, You can do it. You've just got to do it in the right way.
Yeah. And that's why talking again to a qualified advisor is the most important part of the process, really. Let's move a little bit away from that. I'm very keen to help people who are in stress in the industry, but the best way you can do that, guys, is contact Tony or contact Damien, quite frankly. Self-servingly, let's move to talking about funding and talking about litigation. You're both experienced litigators on both sides, and you've both done work with litigation funders. When's the right time for you to approach a litigation funder, and what are the best things a litigation funder can do to help you?
Well, I guess ultimately we would seek advice from our lawyers as to whether or not a claim that we have identified has legs. We'd seek advice from counsel, and once we're comfortable that there's a claim that's worthy of being pursued ultimately for the benefit of creditors, we would seek. We would search out a funder. Now, rates are important, but ultimately it's the flexibility around progressing to the litigation phase.
And when you're, can you talk us through your approach as a liquidator or insolvency practitioner to investigating and commencing the sort of claims that might be funded? Like, obviously, you're an experienced investigator. Do you have key things that you look for in every matter that leads you down a path of
ultimately,
litigation?
every claim, I think quite simply, where did the money go? So it's following the money trail is ultimately is the first thing that we would look at. Obviously, it comes down to the claim that we're pursuing, but first thing we would look at is where did the money go? Public examinations are an excellent tool of fleshing out the value of the claim, which we would ultimately seek a funder to fund before we commence the litigation phase. So look, there are many different ways to skin a cat, I guess, but there is a process we need to follow.
And again, keeping with the conversation around when to get advice, I'm assuming that it's a similar sort of message. Early is better.
Early is better.
Yeah. Damien, turning to the company side, because obviously we'll have some liquidators listening to this, and I like to help the profession as much as I can. When you're talking on the company side around preparing for these sorts of claims, do you have some top advice that you give on the company side or to directors?
Settle.
Yeah.
There is when you're going through a restructuring process and you've got litigation, it's incredibly distracting for management. It can often detract from the overall restructuring process, creates an enormous amount of noise. It's very expensive. So the first thing we do, it's kind of like going through a divorce. You sit down and you go, look, as bad as this looks, the litigation is going to be far worse and far more uncertain. Get your checkbook out now and let's see what deal we can cut to do this early, because early is going to get you a better figure than letting this run up to letting all the evidence come out, going through the dock, and then getting to the steps of the court and settling there.
Yep. Good. That's music to my ears. I love hearing that. Obviously, we would hope that every defendant we ever struck would settle, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Tony, going down a slightly different track, you and I both spent significant time in the service of the Crown, working in the insolvency space. You can choose not to answer this and flick it back to me if you want, but do you have any views on the use of government funding in insolvency matters and any tips that you might have from your experience in extracting that sort of funding?
Oh, look, I think our hit rate is pretty, I think across the industry, is fairly low on particularly getting funding out of ASIC, let alone the ATO. I think, in my experience, you can basically put a red ribbon around a brief and it still gets knocked back. So look, the funding is there, but it seems quite difficult. It's very difficult to obtain. So look, obviously seeking a private funder is a lot more attractive and faster in progressing a claim.
And look, that was probably, and again, listeners, it might sound a little bit self-serving, but that's certainly what I was going to say. having had the experience of leading a government fund and now leading a private fund, from my experience, there's often we'll go to the government first kind of approach.
Yep.
That I certainly would be saying to practitioners, do that if that's what you would like to do, but you're probably losing time, which is the worst thing that you could do. So having an approach that is going to both a private funder and a government funder at the same time is probably the more preferred approach. I'm assuming both of you'd agree with that.
Yeah, look, part of that is you would go to government as a first step in the same way you go to credit as a first step, so that you don't have the argument later on as to why you went to an external funder at what is often a more significant cost.
Tony, anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's almost, my feeling is it's almost you're just ticking a box to say you've done it. But look, on occasion it does come off, but it's certainly less flexible than seeking external funding.
All right, it's now time to get the crystal ball out. I couldn't resist the opportunity to ask you guys some questions about what you think is going to come at us. Obviously, we're recording this podcast in the second last week of FY 23-24.
Yeah, wow.
Can't believe that. Financial year 24-25 is bearing down on us. Let's go with the top three. What are the top three trends you expect to see in the insolvency market for the coming financial year? Damien, you can go first.
Look, I'm going to call. I think there's at least one major construction company that's going to collapse before December.
Mm-hmm.
That's an industry that's had its wafer-thin margins. It's had working capital tied up in bank guarantees. It's been highly competitive, and it's been one of the biggest victims of subcontractor and insolvency. And FY22 had the worst wet weather.
Mm-hmm.
Those businesses haven't recovered. In New South Wales, we've had the Building Commissioner and the Building and Design Act, which has increased the cost of rectification work. So those builders have been hit with a lot of defect claims and defect management claims, and stronger body corporates and strata managers that are sort of far more aggressive in terms of how they're managing it. And I think there's at least one that's going to come unstuck.
That's one. I'm going to come back to you. Let you think a little bit more. Tony, what's the top trend that you expect to see?
We haven't heard much from the OSR. I think ATO is obviously on an enforcement rampage, if I can call it that, at the moment, and I think that's going to keep on going. But the OSR, I feel like they're the sleeping giant. I think we should see a lot more activity out of them next year.
Which is interesting because each state has their own Office of State Revenue, so we might actually see some states ahead of other states. Do you think?
Yeah, that's quite possible.
Any other trends? Anything else coming to mind? I've got one, but I'll let you guys go first.
Look, the cities haven't recovered to the extent that they thought they would. So the traffic's still sitting, I think, across the major cities at maybe 80% of what it was pre-COVID. And it's not as consistent. Working from home has changed the way offices are built, and as a result, there's an enormous amount of space, especially in New South Wales, that's coming onto the market. So I think there's going to be a lot of stress across the office retail market, especially in the city areas, and that's going to, at some point, start to funnel through to the funds that hold them and funnel through to the banks that have the debt on them.
That's. I think we see. Obviously, I co-locate Sydney and Brisbane most weeks, and that's the most startling thing to me on a Monday morning when I come into Sydney, is just the lack of traffic on the way in, the lack of people about on a Monday morning, and that's the best indicator I think you can get.
Brisbane's been an amazing city. It's shown, because they closed their borders, they've come out much stronger. They've got the Olympics in 8 years' time. They're hitting it out of the park as far as the redevelopment of the city, people relocating into the city. Hospitality is on the increase in Queensland. It's a different market full of Queenslanders. But we're very much, you can see the difference now between Brisbane and Sydney, and Sydney and Melbourne.
Oh, and again, being in the CBDs, the Olympics is an interesting thing that you raise. I actually see that as a bit of a midterm trend / potential problem looming on the horizon. I obviously love sport, love Brisbane, love everything about the fact that we've got the Olympics, the fact that we're not redeveloping the Gabba now and we're moving the Olympics seemingly back out to Nathan. From what I read in the paper, if that's true, I think that's going to create a real midterm problem in the Queensland market, along with labour and getting labour in. But that's not for the coming financial year, and we could do a whole other podcast on that. Tony, any other trends? Anything else you expect?
I think the SBRs, I think that will keep on going. I think we touched on this before, but I think the thresholds need to change, and I think there's going to be some focus on that. But I think there'll be more appointments. And as Damien mentioned, restructuring, getting in early and restructuring the business rather than your formal liquidation. I think we'll see a lot more of that next year.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Tony. I think there's been with the SBRs, there's been a shortfall both by ASIC and by government in terms of educating the market, and they've very much relied on practitioners like ourselves getting out there and telling people how to do it, and we're basically running that education piece, and that does need to be done by government. They introduced this legislation; it was great. The uptake has been incredibly slow. And what they do need to do is get out there and start educating directors about what the opportunities are. Because to Tony's point before, we're getting at it too late. And that goes for SBRs as well. You know, if you're just there to clean up the mess, that's not what that was designed to do.
So again, the message is go early. We need help. We do need help from government to promote these things. I should say my trend, slightly left of field, is every practitioner I talk to needs more staff, and every practitioner I talk to needs more staff at what we'd call the intermediate level. I think we're going to see the next round of superstars of insolvency emerge in the next financial year and the years to come, and I think they're going to be able to really pick where they go to firms that do really, really good work, and I think the good firms are going to thrive. But I do think we're going to see a consolidation in the bottom end of the market because they just don't have the people to do the work that they've got coming in. That's all the time we've got for today. We could talk for hours on this stuff. I didn't even get to talk about cricket, which irritates me because that's normally where I'd like to go with these things. But look, thank you very much for taking the time to join me on In Clover. Obviously, listeners, if you want to reach out to an insolvency professional right at the top of their game, reach out to Damien and Tony at Olvera. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the In Clover podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much.
Always a pleasure, sir.
Thanks, David.